Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out today. My name is Justin Touchette. I'm the Vice President of Spectrum.
And I'm Dan Rankel, the Marketing Coordinator for Spectrum. Spectrum is Boston University's GLBTQA undergraduate cultural organization.
Today, we are welcoming Joe Solmonese, the President of the Human Rights Campaign, or the HRC for short. The Human Rights Campaign is a national nonprofit organization for LGBT rights. And Joe himself is an alumni of Boston University, graduating in comm in 1987. So it is an honor to have him back at BU today to speak with us. And afterwards, there will be a short question and answer session. And if you would please, if you have a question, wait until Dan will have a microphone. If you will wait till the microphone gets to you before you speak so that the camera can hear what you're saying. So if you'd all please join me in welcoming Joe Solmonese.
Thanks, everybody. So I graduated in 1987. I'm just curious, how many people were born by 1987? Oh, that's more encouraging than I thought. Okay. I have two people with me today. Brad Luna, who's a communications director at HRC, and my friend Mark Walsh, who is in the bathroom. He works with me at HRC. He went to BU and BU Law School, and he reminded me on the way over here today that we were recounting our days at BU, and he said, a lot of the people that you're going to be talking to today weren't born when we were there. So it sort of put things in perspective for me. I came here, as you may know, in 1983. I did sort of, the BU journey. I started in is it still called SMG? I started in SMG, and then, I hated that. That shouldn't be on the camera probably, but it was really hard. And I sort of backed out of that, and I was an anthropology major for a while. And then I went to the College of Communication, where I sort of stuck with it and graduated from the College of Communication in '87. I was meeting with some of the folks from Spectrum earlier, and they were asking me about the existence of an LGBT student group when I was here, and I said, I feel like I need to really rewind and sort of remind people of what it was like here in the '80s. Not only was there no LGBT group, but there was one gay guy, and it wasn't even me. Surprisingly, there was one guy who was out and openly gay, as best I could tell, and I think there were like 36,000 students here, so there probably were more, but at least, in the universe that I functioned in, which was 203 Bay State Road, where I lived, comm, to the George Sherman Union, like in that little orbit, there was one gay guy. And I say that because when I came into the union today, I was absolutely overwhelmed by, there's like Chinese food, and there's like the something in the kettle and a Starbucks. And like when I was here and you walked into the union, it was a big open space. And there were long tables, like maybe what your high school cafeterias were like. And there was like a little window in the back where you brought your tray and they put your food. And like it was like you either got the food or you got pizza. Like pizza was special. It was either like the food or pizza. That was it. And so, we would have lunch here every day and, have like pizza and a Coke basically. I always remember that, that one gay guy, he was a tall blonde guy, and he rode crew, walked through, I think someone told me it's called the catwalk. Is that what you call it? Oh, even that's a little dated. All right, well, anyways, the space that's open between the tables. And everybody looked at him, and everybody sort of stopped and said, well, there's the gay guy. And the way that the people around me reacted to the gay guy, as you can may be able to imagine, wasn't exactly something that inspired me to want to be, the second gay guy, or at least the second out gay guy. So, that and the fact that I was just over at the College of Communications with the dean, and he was asking me about the computer lab, and I said, when I was here, we had typewriters. we didn't have computers. So those two things tell me that things have really changed a lot here at BU in the last 20 years, and I'm really thrilled, and I'm thrilled that there's such a strong organization, and I'm thrilled that they're doing such great work, and that they invited me to be here today, and that they're such a source of inspiration and support and networking for all of the GLBT students who are here on campus. The other thing that the other memory that I had of being at BU that I mentioned, I think, in the BU magazine a while back, and I thought about when I came out here today, was that not only was there one gay guy, and that really sort of, I think, spoke to the atmosphere, not just here, but in college campuses generally in the 80s, was that, I always remember being a student, I think I was a sophomore. I lived at 203 Bay State Road in the back on the riverside, and hearing that there was a story in Time magazine about this thing that they were calling the gay cancer. And someone said that, Time magazine had finally written the first story, the first thing to see print about this thing that they couldn't quite figure out, but it was like cancer that was only happening in gay men. And, of course, as you all know, that was the very earliest days of what became the AIDS epidemic. And it was just beginning when I was a sophomore here. And that's, it's another important point to remember, I think, about, a layer of stigma and difficulty that was put on somebody my age who was maybe struggling with who he was in an environment and a time when there really wasn't a whole lot you could do about it. So, when I left here, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I was very fortunate. Again, there's something about who lives on Bay State Road? I think that's there's an advantage to living on Bay State Road, I guess, which is that when I was a freshman and a sophomore, I lived with a lot of upperclassmen, and they graduated and they went off to do really interesting things around the city of Boston, and I was still here. But they became a real resource for me when I thought about what I was going to do with my life and what I was going to do for a living, and a couple of them were working in the State House for then Governor Michael Dukakis, and they were a great resource for me, and that was actually one of the first internships I did. And so the summer between my junior and senior year, and then all during my senior year, I worked in the Massachusetts State House in the governor's office, and that's really what exposed me to politics and to activism and to meeting people. At the time, Massachusetts was actually working to pass its first gay rights bill, its first non-discrimination bill, and to meet people who were doing that kind of work and working to fight HIV and AIDS and in the civil rights movement generally, and that and being at BU really exposed me to sort of the big world that I would continue to work in and live in for the last 20 years. And I should also tell you, just by way of like some street cred, that then in my senior year, I also was an RA in Warren Towers in 11C, which was the comm floor then, and apparently it's the comm floor now. Did you know that? Well, at any rate, so what's, I think, very interesting is, over the last 20 years since I've been here, what it's like to be out and open and living here at BU it really mirrors what it's like to be out and open and living out in this country. You heard a little bit about what it was like back in the 80s, what it was like to be going to college and living in Boston at the time. What sort of happened in terms of a parallel with the movement over the last 20 years, I think, is an interesting thing to remind you of as well. The AIDS epidemic, the end of the 1980s, the end of the Reagan era, a hopeful moment for the GLBT community and for GLBT equality was the election of Bill Clinton in 1992. At the time, probably the most GLBT supportive president that we had ever elected. Unfortunately, President Clinton's first 2 years didn't go as well as they probably should have. He everything from his attempt to pass a health care plan to his attempt to overturn the ban on gays in the military led up to a complete turnaround in Congress in 1994. And even though we're a bipartisan organization and we support people on both sides of the aisle, the fact of the matter is that the turnover in Congress in 1994, Republican control of Congress, and Newt Gingrich, and what they called the Gingrich agenda through the 90s really was probably the thing that worked against the advancement of GLBT equality more than anything else. And so what, as a movement, we were really struck with, 5 or 10 years into the AIDS epidemic, was really being very much a defensive posture. So the kinds of things that we were doing were trying to get a bill passed called the Ryan White Care Act, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's the singularly most important funding mechanism to battle HIV and AIDS in this country. It was then, and it continues to be now. The idea that the best thing that we could get done for our community was pass, a funding measure to fight HIV and AIDS is sort of appalling all these years later. But that's really the best that we were able to get done. And as the 90s went along, people sometimes say to me, well, why haven't we made more advances in the name of GLBT equality? And I remind people, as the 90s went along and people who were singularly committed to work against us became more emboldened in their agenda, things became even more difficult for our community. And we find ourselves, having to battle things like a federal marriage amendment. Some chucklehead's idea in Congress that we ought to write discrimination against same-sex couples into the Constitution permanently and enshrine it there and say no one can ever get married. So, we were finding ourselves not advancing a proactive agenda, but having to fight the federal marriage amendment not once, but twice. And as many of you may know, both times when we set out to fight and defeat the federal marriage amendment, we actually were successful, and we've defeated it twice. So we had really, for more than a decade, been in a sort of a defensive, reactive position in terms of moving forward an LGBT agenda. And quite frankly, we have been almost up until the last 2 years. Since 2004, when we lost scores of marriage fights all across the country, you may remember that there were ballot measure bans in 13 states around the country in 2004, and we lost all of them. The only place for a very long time that marriage equality has been in place is here in Massachusetts, as you know. And that's been a tough road for us to hoe. We now have marriage in Connecticut, as you all probably heard. The court just ruled there last week. Of course, in the state of California, which we're battling to hold on to. And in 10 days from now, we will know whether we're going to permanently be able to keep marriage in place there. But those marriage battles have been enormously difficult for our community, and it really hasn't been until 2006. When there was a fundamental shift in the makeup of Congress, when the Iraq War really more than anything else said to the American people, we got to get rid of the people there and put some new people in. Now, that ended up working to the Democrats' advantage, and the Democrats ended up taking over both the House and the Senate. And as a result, really for the first time in our movement's history, we were able to pass a hate crimes bill, and we passed the Matthew Shepard hate crimes bill through the House and the Senate in the last 2 years. We were able to begin the work of passing a non-discrimination bill, an employment non-discrimination bill. We started with a bill in the House that only protected on the basis of sexual orientation, not gender identity and expression, but we're going to build on that bill, and we're going to get a fully inclusive bill before it becomes law. We began to start to advance some things like same-sex recognition at the federal level for same-sex couples, like trying to eliminate the tax that people pay on domestic partner benefits, or extending domestic partner benefits to federal employees, or speaking to any of the other economic disadvantages that same-sex couples face. And of course, we began the process of trying to overturn the ban on gays in the military. All of that began to change in the last 2 years when people like Nancy Pelosi and John Conyers and Barney Frank and George Miller and others took over committee chairmanships and moved that legislation for us. Now, The fact of the matter is it didn't move much further than Congress because we had and continue to have a president in place who made very clear that he was going to veto anything that he was given that was an advancement for the GLBT community. So he issued a veto threat in response to the passage of the hate crimes bill. He said he would veto the employment non-discrimination bill. He pretty much said he'd veto anything that came to his desk. So where we stand now, really, I think, as a community and as a movement, is in a very important place. And in the next 10 days, as you can imagine, we really stand to be able to take all of the work that we've done in the last, say, decade or so and take it to a whole new place if we're successful in electing Barack Obama president, which I certainly feel that we are going to be. Senator Obama is someone who has said that he will sign the hate crimes bill, that he supports a fully inclusive Employment Non-Discrimination Act, that he'll work to overturn Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He's someone who I have seen beyond just a set of issues, speak to largely straight audiences and talk about the need for straight audiences, communities of color, to do a better job of embracing LGBT people. He did that. Some of you should take a look at the speech that he gave. I think it's probably the best speech he's ever given, and a speech that's not a lot of people haven't seen, at the Ebenezer Baptist Church last year, or earlier this year, I should say, on Martin Luther King Day, where he stood before an almost exclusively African-American straight audience and challenged that audience to do a better job of bringing along and embracing their LGBT brothers and sisters. That kind of stuff really matters in terms of bridging gaps between disparate groups of people in this country. So the possibility of electing someone like this president and the commitment that he has made to take the work that we've done, to take the gains that we've made and brought through Congress and sign them into law is going to move this community further in the next 2 years than we've moved in the last 40. And that is a very significant milestone that we stand, I think, ready to cross in the next 10 days. The other milestone, of course, that we really stand poised to cross, I think, is the possibility, as I said, of defeating the marriage ban in California. If we're successful in defeating that ban in California, I think what will happen in pretty short order is that we will have the state of New Jersey, the state of New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, and of course Massachusetts have marriage equality. What that means is that in the next couple of years, 25% of the people in this country will live in a state where same-sex couples can be married. That's a huge accomplishment for this community when you think about the fact that in 2004, we couldn't defeat one of these things. So the passage, the success in California of defeating this amendment is hugely important in the next 10 days. And as I said, I think that the ability to do that, the ability to elect Barack Obama president, is going to mean more to this community than anything we've done probably in the last 40 years. Now, that's sort of the legislative and the issues journey that we've been on over the last 20 years. The other thing that I think is really important to mention in terms of progress that we've made in the last 20 years is the idea that members of our community have felt more empowered to be out and open about who they are. That idea alone has done more to advance us probably than the election of any person or the advancement of any legislative agenda, because what that does is it moves the American people's mindset. It moves public opinion. It changes people's views about these issues. We can pass a hate crimes bill, but unless we can do something to erase hate in this country and to get people to start thinking in a different way, it's not going to be enough. So the idea that corporate America is now a place that you can walk into and feel comfortable about being out and open in terms of who you are, that your school, that your doctor's office, that your church is a place that you can feel better now than you used to about being out and open about who you are, changes everything. I went to speak to a group of gay employees at a place called Pennsylvania Power and Light in Allentown, Pennsylvania, a while back. Are you from Allentown? Bethlehem. Okay, well, So it's probably, I've never been to Bethlehem, but I'm assuming it's kind of the same. At the risk of making a sweeping generalization about Western Pennsylvania, I'll assume it's similar. So, so there were some gay people that worked at Pennsylvania Power and Light, and there was probably a group of, maybe the size of this that came to hear me talk about our work in corporate America. And a man came up to me at the end of my speech, and he said, I'm straight, and I came here today to support my fellow employees who came here to this event. And he said, but the other reason that I came here is because, he said, I've worked in this company for, I think he'd worked there for, 10 years. And he sat next to a woman for about 8 of those years who came to work every day. And every day, every Monday, he'd say, how was your weekend? And she would say, fine. How was yours? And he'd say, fine. And he'd go on to talk about what he did and his family and his wife and his kids. And she really never said much, and he never asked. And every year that went by, Pennsylvania Power and Light did things like extended domestic partner benefits, or honored Pride Month, or sponsored the AIDS Walk, or did something that made the GLBT workforce feel more empowered to be out and open in the workplace. And so about 2 years ago, this woman named Lisa, who came to work every day for however many years and didn't say too much, came out to him and told him that she was a lesbian. And he said, in that moment, I had a lot of ideas about what I thought about lesbians. But I also had a lot of ideas in terms of what I thought about Lisa. And those two concepts sort of collided, because Lisa now put a name and a face and a story and a friendship and a whole set of life circumstances to an abstract idea that for a very long time he couldn't really put any of that to. And so in the blink of an eye, everything that he thought about lesbians went away, because it had all become replaced by what he thought about this woman who, more than anything, was his friend, and was now somebody who he could really take this abstract concept and personify. And so for him, everything changed. Now, I tell that story because I think, for all the stuff I talked about a legislative agenda and all the work that we've done to become more empowered as a community and to elect good people and pass laws, that idea is singularly important, because, when someone says to me, what are you all doing, about the fight for marriage equality in this country? I tell them that story. I tell them that we work with corporate America and we make corporate America a more welcoming place for people to come out. We work with churches and we make religious settings a more welcoming place for people to come out. We have a new program called our Healthcare Equality Project. We're working with America's hospitals and trying to get hospitals to be a more welcoming and equitable place for GLBT people to come in and be out and open about who they are. Because again, when members of our community can do that, and they can have that similar conversation with a coworker, a teacher, a minister, or the admitting person in an emergency room, it inevitably changes the mindset for that person. And so that person's mindset on issues like marriage or workplace discrimination or hate crimes or any of these other big, broad issues changes, because all of a sudden it's taken on a human aspect. And so those of you who are out and open about who you are here at BU are probably doing a lot more than you think in terms of changing the mindset and the hearts and minds of the world around you. So I commend you for that. I congratulate you for that. And again, I'm so thrilled. I'm thrilled to be back here. I'm a little bit I mean, if it weren't for the dugout, I would feel like I was on a different planet. But that seems like the only thing that's really sort of remained the same since I've been here. But as I said, I had a wonderful experience here. I learned a lot about life. I learned a lot about the world. I learned a lot about the possibilities that existed in the world by coming to BU. And I hope that you're having the same experience here. And I hope that you really take advantage of that, and that you really take advantage of all, not just that Boston University has, but the city of Boston has to offer. So with that, I would love to hear from you and take your questions.
Hi, thanks very much for being here. My name is Dan Levin. I'm a third-year student at the School of Law. You mentioned some of the legislative priorities that you expect to go better, assuming Senator Obama is elected, like ENDA and the Tax Equity Acts and things like that. Do you have any concept of where we are in priorities? Because obviously there's a lot going on in the country and the world, and where do we rank?
Well, I think we as a community. I mean, it's kind of, you're asking two good questions, and I think if you were the environmental community, the women's reproductive rights community, the educational community, the anti-war, well, not the anti-war community, but the LGBT community, we're all wanting to ensure that we are part of this next administration's agenda, and an administration that is probably going to be pretty heavily focused on bailing out the economy and dealing with the war. But, I think that what you're going to see, the difference between, say, when Bill Clinton came in and the community, I'll speak for the LGBT community, wasn't as organized about having a conversation with the transition team about what an LGBT agenda would look like. That's kind of why we got Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The president went in. He wanted to do the right thing for the community. He found when he got in there in the first 90 days that he didn't have, nor was he willing to use the kind of political capital he was going to need to issue an executive order to overturn Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or to overturn the ban on gays in the military. So we ended up with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The administration's posture was it's better than what you had before. The community's was it's in some ways it's worse than what we had before. So I think the difference is that we have, as a community and as an organization, a strong connection with the Obama campaign and with what will be a transition team about what our priorities would be. So, for instance, the hate crimes bill, what you call a ripe piece of legislation, for lack of a better term. It passed through the House and it passed through the Senate. It passed through the Senate by 60 votes. It'll pass by even more than that the next time they take a vote for it, given what the makeup of the Senate will be. Generally speaking, a piece of legislation like that that's primed and ready to go and gone through both bodies of Congress would be something that I would think that an Obama administration would sign in the first, maybe within the first 6 months of his administration. I think if you were to ask anybody in the community, the expectation would be that the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, the degree to which we can work out what we need to do in Congress to try to get that to be a fully inclusive bill and include sexual orientation and gender identity, that would determine when that would probably be ready to go. But you talked about the Tax Equity Act. I think probably the next things we'd be able to get done would be any of the things that would sort of close the economic gap that exists for same-sex couples. We got, even in a Bush administration, an elimination of the tax and penalty that you pay when you inherit your partner's 401k or a pension. So I think we could get some of those things done, probably wrapped up in bigger bills. The one thing that I think we need a sort of universal understanding on, an Obama administration, Congress, the community, and the military, would be Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and how we would approach working to overturn Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And that's to my way of thinking, that's a more long-term strategy. And we want to make sure that, there's real transparency and that everybody's on the same page in terms of what that looks like. So that if collectively all of us agree that's a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year plan, somebody out there in the community, and we're transparent about that with the community, somebody in the community at least can say, I don't know what I think about hate crimes first and Don't Ask, Don't Tell later, but at least I feel like there's an agreed upon strategy.
Hi, thanks for coming. You did great on the Colbert Report a little while back. My question is that in one sense, you say that we are for equality, and that's one of the things that HRC promotes. On the other hand, with things like the Matthew Shepard bill, you're looking for hate crimes for something that would be de facto giving special rights to homosexuals or anyone else in the LGBT community, because straight people aren't generally made fun of for being straight. So how do you reconcile those two different notions?
Well, what the hate crimes bill does, I don't know if you probably haven't read the hate crimes bill because you probably have more important things to read. But what the hate crimes bill does is not give special rights to anybody. What it does is it recognizes that there are different sorts of crimes that are committed in this country. And, in the 60s, during the civil rights era, when someone would go up and either burn down a church or spray a swastika on a synagogue, law enforcement didn't sort of look at that and say, arson graffiti. They recognized that there was more at work there, that there was something else going on there, and that, when 2 or 3 synagogues were spray painted with a swastika, or where there was something happening repeatedly over a period of time, it was a crime. It wasn't just graffiti on a building. It was really crime and fear that was being perpetrated among a community of people. So law enforcement recognized that there was a difference there. It wasn't that they were saying that you got to give the people who go to that synagogue any kind of special rights. You might have to give them special protection, or at least recognize there was something bigger going on there if there was a threat to their safety, which obviously graffiti has nothing to do with a threat to a person's safety, but you can see that, perhaps there was something more going on there. So they passed a bill back then called the Church Arson Act, which basically said that in those sorts of situations, local law enforcement would have the ability to contact federal authorities for any number of resources they might need to combat that sort of crime. Well, what the hate crimes bill does is the same thing when hate crimes are perpetrated against members of the LGBT community. And really, it's a piece of legislation that is born out of a reaction from local law enforcement. What local law enforcement would contact us and say, there's something going on in my community. There's violence being perpetrated against a whole community of people here, and I would like to reach out to the federal authorities, just as I would if it was, say, religious-based violence, like the example I gave you. And we're finding when they would reach out to federal authorities with very tangible things that they were looking for to either investigate or prosecute these crimes, that the federal authorities, either the Justice Department or the Civil Rights Division or the FBI, would say, that sort of activity that you're talking about doesn't merit our involvement. So local law enforcement could clearly see they had real clear needs that they in these particular crimes that they could see what it was that they needed and what they needed to reach out for, and they were told by the federal authorities, sorry, that doesn't merit our involvement. So all that the hate crimes bill does is change that so that it does. Now, the other thing that it does is, in as much as lots of local sheriffs and local police chiefs can give us very tangible reasons why they need this bill in place, the unfortunate fact of the matter is, every once in a while, like a case in Texas some of you may know about, local law enforcement sees this stuff going on, and they don't do nearly what they should do. And yes, there are all sorts of crimes committed against all sorts of kinds of people, but the unfortunate fact of the matter is that in some parts of this country, when these sorts of crimes are committed against some members of the LGBT community, local law enforcement doesn't do what they should do. And so the other thing that this bill does is, if you're the victim of that sort of crime somewhere out in America, where local law enforcement's not doing what they're supposed to do, and unfortunately we hear about this from time to time as well, you have some recourse to go elsewhere to get somebody involved in investigating or prosecuting these crimes. So that's what the bill does.
Hi, I had a question. Could you talk about the scenario in which, let's say Barack Obama is elected president, but also the marriage ban passes in California, and what that would mean for marriage and other forms of relationship recognitions in this country? And also, is there any sort of timeline where we can say, in 20 years we can revisit these marriage bans and maybe we can put them up for vote again and they can get repealed? Thanks.
Well, if we lose in California, I think probably, win or lose in California, the fight for marriage equality really, it comes back east, because I do think that in New York, for instance, if the Democrats need to win 2 legislative seats in the state of New York, and they will pass a marriage bill, and the governor of New York has said he'll sign it. I think New Jersey will do the same thing fairly soon. You saw that we have marriage in Connecticut. I think, some of the other New England states, New Hampshire, a state where they just did civil unions, I think that's a state that would legislatively pass a marriage bill someday and have a governor that would sign it. So I think the fight will sort of come back to the Northeast, and at some point, by the time you get to Philadelphia or so, you can pretty much start getting married. So I think that's probably where it's going to go next. Now, then the next big hurdle would be 2 things. I think the other thing is that I always say to people, there's 1,100 federal benefits that you can't get because you can't get married. So what are your top 5? And people generally, depending on who you talk to, they can tell you what those federal benefits are that they really miss, that they really are missing and they could use. I think for the federal level, we could start to chip away at that with some federal legislation. But then the long, hard slog is going to be, how do you undo some of the stuff that's been done in these states? And are there some states out there that have passed marriage amendments, say in 04 or 06, that we could start to undo? A state like Oregon, where we narrowly lost, could you start to turn that around?
You had mentioned talking about agreed upon priorities within the community. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, with ENDA, why HRC, after pledging not to, turned around and said that it would support a not fully inclusive ENDA, even though pretty much most of the other GLBT organizations in the country were only supporting the fully inclusive one.
There were 2 versions of ENDA. The Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which would bar discrimination against members of the LGBT community, was introduced without gender identity and expression in 1996 and lost narrowly, and then, like everything else, sort of sat out in the cold until last year when we were able to bring it back again. We brought a fully inclusive bill before Congress, which means, if you remember, I was going to say the after-school special, but again, you guys probably don't remember this. But there used to be an after-school special where they told you how a bill becomes a law. Anyways, so the first thing it did was, it goes to committee. And in committee, in the Labor HHS Committee of the House, was where we began to get a sense that if the bill went to the floor and when a bill goes to the floor to get passed, it's like when you go to get married, and right before they say "I do," somebody gets to they say "Does anybody object to this?" Well, in Congress, the minority party gets to sort of have an objection and take the bill apart. And what we were hearing was that they were going to say they needed to take out gender identity and expression. They couldn't pass the bill with all of that in it. And when the whip did a count on the floor, he said, we don't have enough votes for gender identity and expression. So the question that was posed to us was, if the non-inclusive bill goes to the floor for a vote, should it pass or fail? And my view was that, if you look at, the president wasn't going to sign it, so we were going to be doing this more than once. We would build a better bill. And if you look at the history of things like the Family and Medical Leave Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act or other big sweeping regulatory civil rights legislation that has, we've had to vote on, say, with the Family and Medical Leave Act 8 times over 8 years, that going to the floor, we were better to lay down a foundation and pass a bill, even if it wasn't the bill we wanted, if we were going to come back and fight another day for a bill we wanted. In other words, a non-inclusive bill, not what we wanted, failing on the floor, would have no foundation to come back with anything. Passing by an overwhelming margin, a sexual orientation-only bill, would say to the members of Congress, okay, we've got room to grow here. So it was a painful and difficult thing within the community, but just to give you an example, what it did for us was it gave us a much more exacting roadmap of how many members of Congress are against anything, how many members of Congress are only for a sexual orientation-only bill, and how many would be for a fully inclusive bill. And you never really got the true count until they took the vote. And so what we know is that disparity between where we are and where we need to be is about 48 members. So all the work we're doing now is trying to move those 48 members to a fully inclusive bill. Now, we've gotten, between 6 and 8 who have said that they'll come on board and do a fully inclusive bill. The other thing that's going to be a huge change is going to be these elections, because we'll probably elect 20 new members in these elections. And so how many of them are people who are going to support a fully inclusive bill who will replace somebody who wouldn't support anything? So the whole deck is going to get reshuffled after these elections. But, I'm glad you asked it, and it's a good question, because there's sort of the public line, and then there's the very complicated, arcane nature of Congress. And so for us, it was making a very difficult decision when posed with this question, what do you think should happen here? And the answer was, this bill should pass.
Thanks. Maybe I missed this before I came in. But what happens if John McCain wins? Where does that put your agenda, and what have you done to prepare for that contingency moving forward in the next 4 years?
Well, if John McCain wins, the one thing that I'm fairly certain of is that wherever we stand in Congress now, we're still likely to advance in terms of the number of LGBT supportive people in the House and the Senate. Even in a place like Colorado, the worst enemy of the community retired and is going to be replaced by someone who's got a 100% record on HRC's issues. He's about 14 points ahead now. It's almost impossible for me to imagine he's going to lose. So I think even if McCain wins, there'll be advances made in Congress. But Senator McCain is someone who has been pretty clear about his opposition to the hate crimes bill, to the employment non-discrimination bill, to overturning Don't Ask, Don't Tell, to the core stuff that we are fighting for. So I think what we're going to have to rely on is a more sophisticated legislative strategy where we say, we're either going to have to attach what we care about to bigger bills that he's going to be forced to sign, which is how we got the pension provisions passed. Excuse me, I don't know if you were here when I was talking about that, but we basically, we had this idea, you ought to be able to leave your partner your pension or your 401k tax-free or penalty-free. We put that into the Pension Protection Act, a 900-page bill with 157 provisions. We just slid one in there, and the Bush administration signed it. So I know this should not be on camera either, but that's how we got it done. So we're going to have a much more sophisticated legislative strategy to say, is there something that we can attach a hate crimes bill to? Are there some, same-sex recognition federal benefits that we can put in a bigger bill that we'll get through? I think that's probably our best chance. The thing about John McCain is, he says he's a federalist. He says that the federal government has no role in local things, which is kind of getting to your point about hate crimes. Philosophically, he's against the hate crimes bill for that reason. Now, it's also why, interestingly, he's against the federal marriage amendment, because he says marriage ought to be left to the states. Now, the only problem with that is it sort of doesn't ring true, because as he opposed the federal marriage amendment at the federal level, a good thing, 2 years ago, he went out to Arizona and made ads encouraging people to ban marriage in the state of Arizona. So, but again, it's why he's against the hate crimes bill. Now, would he be open to something like the Employment Non-Discrimination Act? Could we work on him for that? Because at the end of the day, it's a non-discrimination bill. Like, it keeps people working, or some of these, like if you eliminate the people pay taxes when they get domestic partner benefits. Did you all know that? Like, if you get domestic partner benefits and so you go to work at some big Fortune 500 company and you bring your partner on to get domestic partner benefits, you have to pay a tax on those benefits. Straight people don't pay that, but same-sex couples do. Well, corporations pay a payroll tax on those benefits. So, might John McCain be open to doing something like that because, I don't know, it eliminates a payroll tax for corporations, and it helps with sort of increasing healthcare costs? He might. So, but the sort of my gut reaction is it's a more creative legislative strategy that we're going to have to employ. Well, those were some really good questions.
have another question.
Sure.
Going back to ENDA, could you talk a little bit about, I mean, personally I supported the HRC's actions, but could you talk more about having to balance sort of what you thought was the right thing to do versus communicating that with your members and what they wanted? Because there was definitely a disconnect between that.
Well, I think our members were generally supportive. I think that it was now, there are certainly members who weren't, but I think that where we really had a challenge was in communicating with the broader community. And sometimes, people make the mistake of, HRC and the GLBT community are one and the same. We've got about 1 million members. There's about 15 million members of the community out there. So I think where we had a problem was with communicating with the GLBT community generally. Because, if you got like my fourth, long-winded, bloviating email in a row about what was going on and you were an HRC member, you said like, oh, I got it. Okay. But if you're somebody out there in the community, it's a really, based on your question and my answer, it's a really complicated thing that we were going through. What we were fighting against, though, was, as you pointed out, most other LGBT organizations saying, no, like kill the bill, don't advance the bill. And it's hard because if you look at the list of those organizations, it was a lot of local organizations, it was a lot of community centers, it was a lot of local chapters of national organizations who just sort of very simply could say, are we for doing something that includes everybody or not? Not. And so it was much easier for them, they had a much easier message to convey, which is, don't do something unless it includes everybody. Don't sacrifice a member of the community. So we were trying to tell a very complicated story, and we were fighting against a bigger line of communication with a much simpler message to deliver. And I think, I will say, though, that I think it created an oftentimes difficult and painful conversation in the community that really had not been had before. When we talked about, HRC changed its policy and began advocating for fully inclusive legislation back in 2004, very much in the abstract, without ever having advanced a piece of legislation. The community had never been faced with this sort of question before. So I do think that it prompted a painful, and it continues to, discussion within the community, but a debate that really had, that didn't take place, that really had to. And what I hope ultimately is that now that we all have a pretty clear set of targets, now that we all have an understanding of what the work is before us, that we at the very least are all marching in the same direction in terms of doing that work.
Hi, one more question.
Sure.
Do you think that the recent involvement of Congressman Frank in some of the financial things that have been going on has damaged his ability in any way to push for the civil rights issues for our community?
No, I think that Barney's, here's the thing about Barney. The reason that Barney has been the lead on most LGBT matters is because, he's gay. So he's therefore, supportive of the community, but also because he's one of the most powerful members of Congress and he chairs one of the most powerful committees. And I think that, we're in very complicated terrain here. I mean, Barney's proposal in terms of what we do is the same, was clearly, both Senator Obama and Senator McCain seemed to agree. And whether it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing or sort of not enough. And now that we've done more, I don't know how to evaluate what was the right thing for Congress to do at any step along the way. But I think one thing I know about Barney is that he enjoys an enormous amount of respect in the House. And I think as Democrats increase those margins after November, he's only going to be in a stronger position to advance our issues. I also know that, at least with regard to LGBT issues, most of the leadership of the House looks to Barney in terms of how they're going to vote and how they're going to sort of take their lead there. Did you have a question?
You talked about the difference between, I don't know if this is working. You talked about the difference between legislation and changing actual behavior. And obviously, and you talked about how you guys work with churches and businesses and organizations, but obviously when you're trying to change someone's behavior, it's a little more intricate than that usually. They might have a reason that they are against gay rights in the first place. How do you go about trying to, fight against something that may seem almost intrinsic to people because they've grown up feeling this way?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have something that's, I think the question was, how do you, it's one thing to pass legislation, it's another thing to try and sort of help change hearts and minds by being out and open. But, how do you really shift deep-seated, intrinsic values and views that are oftentimes based in one's faith? And we created something a few years ago called the Religion and Faith Program, which I think is probably one of the most successful things that we've done. And the first thing we did was created a Religion and Faith Council. About 20 people around the country, people like the Bishop Gene Robinson from New Hampshire, and religious leaders from all across the country who go out and act as spokespeople for HRC in doing this work. And it's hard. It's a very complicated thing to do because it's you can sort of debate scripture. You can go in and you can say, look, I know the Bible says this, but the Bible also says this, and you don't believe in that, so why do you believe in this? And but it's much more complicated than that, because for so many people in this country, yes, it's about scripture, but it's also grounded in authority, in who they hear from and who sort of influences their worldviews and their life views. So it's sort of a multi-layered approach, and we do many different things. We provide lectionaries, suggested gospels for people to deliver. We try to sort of meet religious leaders halfway. There are religious leaders in this country like, what's the Purpose-Driven Life guy's name? Rick Warren. Rick Warren, he's the guy that hosted the Saddleback Church debate with Obama and McCain recently. Not somebody who's ever, say, been a supporter of LGBT issues, but somebody who has said, as religious people, we have no business working against GLBT people. All we really have any business doing are following the teachings of Jesus Christ, which were about eradicating poverty and eradicating illness. That's all we should be doing as evangelicals. So it doesn't mean they support gay marriage, but it means it's just not something we should be talking about. So, does he support our agenda? No. But is that, do we need to meet him halfway and figure out how to at least stop people from working against us? Yeah. So we're doing as many creative things as we can within the context of this Religion and Faith Program, which I think is really what you're talking about, where we come up against that sort of a barrier more than any place else.
I was just wondering, if you actually achieve sort of your agenda in California and then eventually in New York, do you think in losing, or rather in gaining so much in sort of your blue states, you may lose the critical mass that will propel you in your more subtle positions, in the redder states?
Well, I think you have to, the fight for marriage equality is inevitably a state-by-state fight. It's no one's going to sort of wave a magic wand and make it be a thing. So it's going to be a state-by-state fight. That's a very inarticulate way of trying to make my point. But so it's going to be a state-by-state fight, and it's going to come to places that are blue, like Massachusetts or California first. I think what's helpful is that the more, it doesn't sort of matter where it is. If you live in Nebraska and you're looking and you're saying, God, a quarter of the people in this country live in a place where, gay people can get married, California, the Northeast. I think that, and they sort of live with it for a while. I think as long as there are lots of places in this country where people can get married, time and the existence of marriage in some places will begin to wear down that resistance everywhere. I think, but you have a really good point. What would really help at least move it a little bit would be like New Jersey. It's not red, but as a Massachusetts native, it's not Massachusetts. At least it helps get a little bit in that direction. And then, a Maryland maybe next or an Oregon. But, the fact of the matter is, because it's a state-by-state thing, like Kansas and Utah, they're just not going to be anytime soon. But at least, again, the more states that have it, I will say one other thing. I think once we get a quarter or a third of the country, we're going to sit with that for a while. You know, that's where we're going to be for a while before we then take the next step and move it everywhere. And you know, we may start to do things like be able to overturn some aspects of DOMA. So you still might not be able to get married in Kansas, but if you're married in New Jersey, the next thing is you'll get, you know, federal benefits to the state of New Jersey.
I guess my question is, will you then lose, like, Massachusetts and New York residents as HRC members?
Oh, because you mean...
Once you accomplish sort of the marriage issue in those states?
Well, I hope not. But it's a really good question. And it's the same thing with California. And what I constantly struggle with, I mean, the HRC dinner's Saturday night, you know, so I'm like I'm writing this in my speech. I'm glad you brought it up. It's this challenge of, you know, you've got marriage in Massachusetts. You've got the ultimate, you know, right that we're all fighting for. Now, you may be able to get married in Massachusetts, but you don't get federal benefits. And federal benefits are, you know, more important probably than the state benefits. That if you sit down with some same-sex couple that's doing their income tax and you ask them, you know, federal versus state, they're going to say, God, those federal benefits are the things we need. So there's that. We still don't have that. So we've got to really, I think, appeal to people in these states to keep helping us do that and keep changing things at the federal level. But we do, and this is something I struggle with all the time, and I'm glad you brought this up, we've got to appeal to people in Massachusetts and California to keep helping us do the job. That, you know, that they have a responsibility, if we are bound by a common humanity as LGBT people, that they've got to help us keep doing this job until, you know, we all are where we need to be. And it's much easier said than done. I mean, you bring up something that is a central challenge to me.
Hi. What difficulties have you faced trying to act as like a single voice for the entire community? And how do you deal with these and other criticisms of the HRC?
Well, I think that probably I try not to act as a single voice for the entire community. Having said that, I still get criticized every day. So I think that one of the great challenges about advocating on behalf of the LGBT community is that we are so diverse in terms of our life experiences, in terms of the sorts of discrimination that we face, and so therefore, in terms of what we think is a priority and what we think should be advanced, you know, first. And you know, and to your question, the guy who asked the question about a legislative priority and agenda, you know, we're going to face that. So that's a very difficult thing to do. And inevitably, when you say something or you put an idea forth or a priority forward, you inspire some people and you enrage others. I've sort of gotten used to it. So, you know, but I think what I really struggle to do is to speak in ways and to talk about the issues that our community faces in ways that at the very least incorporate as many people as possible. So, you know, I was saying this earlier, I think there are members of our community that would be hard-pressed to identify big sources of discrimination that they face. It's just where we are as a movement. And there are other people who face it every day in some form. I think one of the things that does join all of us together is, even if we don't think we face blatant discrimination, we certainly all face some form of economic disparity. And so I try to speak in ways that, you know, people at both ends of the economic spectrum, for instance, can at least appreciate that binds us together. But you know, it's a constant struggle, and HRC is criticized all the time because we're the biggest, because we have, I think, traditionally, when there weren't other groups, been seen as the sole voice of the community, and now there are many other groups doing good work, and because oftentimes we you know, we do things that inspire some people and you know, disappoint others, and it's almost an inevitability. But, you know, it comes with the job. I'm perfectly happy to end on a high note, so. Oh, one last question. All right. Now, don't make it like a hard one and ruin it for everybody, okay?
Yeah. Well, I guess generally, what do we say to the people we know who I've seen people from like different cultural backgrounds. One from a very traditional Islamic background, and one from a very rural background in the Midwest, who for some reason say it makes this whole subject makes them really uncomfortable, and they have a complete misunderstanding about what these alternative orientations are. I know this is a really generic question, but like what would you try to say to someone who's so unfamiliar with like an accurate understanding of all this?
Well, I think that there are sort of two things that you're trying to do. I mean, one is to try and get people to understand and respect and embrace the concept of being an LGBT person. But I think sometimes an easier hurdle to cross is to get people at the very least to, even if they don't, they can't get their head around it, or they can't understand it, or they can't respect it, to at the very least come to some common ground about what the issues are that we're fighting for. You know, I do this in corporate America all the time. When I go speak with like a big HR director or a global, sort of employment person at a big Fortune 500 company, I don't go talk to them about supporting an LGBT agenda in the workplace because it's the right thing to do, because we're on because in a civil rights context, it's morally the thing they should be doing. I make the case to them that from a professional point of view, from a workplace point of view, from a competitive point of view, the right thing to do is to create an open and welcoming environment to attract the most diverse workforce that you can. You don't have to agree with, whether you think people should be gay or not, but if Boeing is going to lose out to McDonnell Douglas in recruiting the best engineers they can because they don't score 100% on the corporate equality index at HRC, generally speaking, that HR guy is going to say, you know what, fine, like we're going to go there and we're going to do that. And I think sometimes you've got to build the case, and sometimes just getting people to open their minds a little bit to not necessarily the thing that they're most uncomfortable with, but maybe the thing or the issue or the fight that is most palatable, opens that door a little bit and enables you to sort of build from there. Great.
We'd like to thank Joe Solmonese for coming. And
thank you all very much.
Thank you. And on a related note, Tuesday, Spectrum is having a meeting at 7 p.m. in CAS room 316, and we will be discussing the current election and GLBTQ rights and how it'll affect us over the next 4 to maybe 8 years. So, thank you.